Hey, before we start diving into another night of unnecessary medieval weirdness, don't forget to like, subscribe, and maybe, I don't know, pretend to care. It helps me sleep at night knowing someone out there fell asleep to this instead of actual therapy, alright? Let's talk about chickens. Yes, chickens. You see, medieval Europe had a thing about rules. Not rules that made sense like don't stab your neighbor, but rules like you must not wear a chicken on your head. Unless you're guilty. Yeah, that was a real thing, and it wasn't even considered strange. The law of public humiliation. In a small 14th century German town, because of course it was Germany, there was an actual law that forced people who lied in court to walk around wearing a live chicken tied to their head. You might think, wow, that's ridiculous. But to a medieval person, this made perfect sense. First, chickens symbolized cowardice. And second, they made a lot of noise. So by strapping one to your head, you were literally broadcasting your shame to everyone within clucking distance. Imagine standing in the town square, feathers flapping in your face, while an old man selling turnips just goes, "Ha, another liar. Classic Tuesday." And the best part? The chicken was sometimes fed beforehand, so it would relieve itself. Mid-parade.com. Justice, Medieval Edition. Why they actually thought it was smart. Here's the thing, these people weren't dumb. They lived in a world where almost everyone knew everyone else. If your reputation was ruined, that was it. You couldn't move towns, start a new Instagram, or rebrand yourself as liar. But so instead of locking people in jail, which was expensive, they made public embarrassment the punishment. It was cheap, fast, and honestly kind of effective. By the time you finished your chicken walk, you'd rather die than lie again. That's efficiency right there. The noble rules were worse. And while peasants got the chicken hat, nobles had their own absurd codes. For example, in France, some nobles were forbidden to eat garlic on Fridays, not for religious reasons, but because garlic breath was considered a form of olfactory violence. So if you smelled bad enough to offend a baron's nose, you could technically be fined. And no, I'm not kidding. There are court records from the 13th century where people were accused of olfactory assault. Can you imagine a knight in full armor storming into court like, "Your Honor, this man's breath did strike me harder than his sword"? The pig trial incident. Now, if you think humans had it bad, wait until you hear what they did to animals. In medieval Europe, pigs could go to trial. Like, actual trials. Witnesses, judges, even a tiny pig-sized noose. In 1386, a pig in Falaise, France, was found guilty of eating a child's face. The court sentenced it to death, and they dressed it up in human clothes for the execution. They said it was to teach the public a moral lesson. I mean, imagine being the guy sewing pants for a pig. You've spent weeks on embroidery school, and now you're crafting little velvet trousers for a condemned farm animal. That's the kind of rule someone wrote, nodded, and said, yes, justice has been served. The laundry rule. Meanwhile, in some English villages, there were laundry laws that said women could only wash clothes on certain days. Why? because the sound of water splashing was said to tempt men into sin. Apparently, nothing got medieval men going, like the sound of someone scrubbing linen in a bucket. So, the church passed laundry quiet hours. If a woman got caught washing clothes at the wrong time, she could be fined or made to kneel in public and pray for purity of thought. Again, not kidding. It's like living in a timeline where moral panic met a bucket of soap, curfew bells, and bedtime laws. Then there were the curfew bells. Every night around 8 p.m., church bells rang across towns. This wasn't just a bedtime reminder. It was a literal law. When you heard the bell, you had to put out your fires, stop talking loudly, and go to bed. The word curfew comes from coverfew, meaning cover your fire. If your chimney still smoked after the bell rang, a guard could knock on your door, fine you, or even dump water through your window. And if you were caught wandering the streets after curfew, congratulations, you are now a knight, which sounds cool, but in medieval language, that meant probably a criminal. The witch tax. And then, of course, we get to everyone's favorite medieval pastime, calling people witches. Some towns even had what's called a witch tax. Basically, if you were accused of witchcraft and survived trial by water, you still had to pay a tax for using forbidden powers. So even if you didn't drown, you went broke. This was the medieval version of you beat the boss, but you still lose all your loot. Bread, laws, the holy loaf. Now let's talk about bread. In 13th century England, they had something called the Assize of Bread and Ale. It was literally a government law that decided how big your bread loaf should be. If you baked it too small, you'd be put in the pillory wooden frame where people threw food at you. The irony, they usually threw bread. So picture this. You're a baker who made a slightly light loaf, and now you're standing there with your own bread being launched at your head. Some historians say this was meant to prevent price manipulation. But honestly, it sounds more like the first ever Yelp review system. And finally, my favorite one, the pointy shoe law. In the late 14th century, men's shoes had ridiculously long tips. Some were over half a meter long. They had to tie the ends to their knees with little strings just to walk. So, naturally, the church banned them. Their reasoning, the devil enters through the point of vanity. That's a poetic way of saying you look dumb. But nobles didn't care. Instead of stopping, they just made the shoes longer. It became a status symbol. The longer your shoe, the higher your rank. There's even a story of a duke whose shoes were so long, he had to be carried by 2 servants whenever he walked. It's like saying, I may not be able to move, but at least I'm fashionable. The bigger picture. So yeah, from chicken hats to pig trials. These rules sound insane now, but most of them actually worked. They kept social order, saved money, and, weirdly enough, made people behave, because in a time without police, internet, or deodorant, embarrassment was the only law that really mattered. The louder the punishment, the faster the confession, and that's medieval logic for you. If it clucks, smells, or jingles, it's probably justice. Let's start with a classic, bathing. You'd think people in the Middle Ages didn't bathe because they didn't know how. No, they knew. They just weren't allowed to. After the Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century, people started connecting open pores with death. They thought that warm water opened the body to bad air, the infamous miasma. So, in some towns, public bathhouses were actually banned by law. If you were caught bathing too often, priests could accuse you of tempting illness and lust, because apparently, if you smell like cabbage soup and goat hair, you're safe from sin. And the irony, bathhouses were some of the cleanest places in town, with fresh herbs, scented water, and even music. But that was also the problem. They were too nice. People started enjoying them, and nothing terrified the medieval church more than people enjoying anything. The dining table commandments. Now, let's move to the dinner table, the place where social rules became Olympic, level, absurd. Medieval etiquette guides were basically written by people who hated joy. One book from the 15th century actually lists 25 dining sins. Here are a few of my favorites. Do not scratch your head while eating. Do not blow on your food, lest you show impatience. Do not lick your fingers, for that is the mark of gluttony. And never, under any circumstance, pick your teeth with your knife. Now, that last one I kind of get, but the others? Imagine sitting through a medieval dinner. No forks yet, just spoons and hands. And you're not allowed to lick your fingers. That's not dinner. That's torture. Also, if you spilled wine, you had to apologize to the table, not the person you spilled it on. The table, because the table was considered God's resting place. So next time you drop your drink, just say, "Sorry, divine surface," and you'll fit right in with the 1300s. Now, when night came, so did bed rules. There were laws about when you could go to bed, how you could sleep, and even what position was considered holy. Sleeping face down was sinful because it imitated the dead. Sleeping on your back was risky because it invited impure dreams. So what did they recommend? Sleeping on your right side, hands together like you're constantly... Basically, everyone was supposed to sleep like they were posing for a funeral statue. And if you were married, the church had rules for that too. There were official no intimacy days. Wednesdays, Fridays, Sundays. Lent, Advent, Easter, Christmas, and a bunch of saint days, all together. That meant you could only, celebrate marriage about 60 days a year. And if your neighbor saw you breaking the rule, they could actually report you to the priest. Medieval people were basically living in a 24/7 HOA of morality. The combing rule. Then there's the hair rule. In some English towns, women weren't allowed to comb their hair outside. Why? Because brushing in public was considered summoning vanity, and apparently vanity summoned demons. So, yes, brushing your hair too confidently could make people think you were in league with Satan. One 13th century preacher even warned, "The devil hides behind the mirror and waits for the proud," which sounds dramatic, but it also explains why medieval mirrors were made of metal. You couldn't see much in them, just enough to regret your life choices. Clothing crimes. Clothing, of course, had its own insane rulebook. The sumptuary laws told people exactly what colors, fabrics, and decorations they could wear, based entirely on their class. If you were a peasant and wore silk, fine. If you were caught wearing purple, the royal color, prison, or worse, public shaving. That's right, they'd shave your head in the market square for wearing the wrong outfit. Imagine saving up for a nice tunic, showing up at the festival, and suddenly a guard yells, "Nice fabric, commoner, prepare for barber justice." And nobles weren't safe either. 1. English law literally forbade lords from wearing shoes made of foreign leather, because, and I quote, "foreign cow is a symbol of foreign thought." So yes, they feared imported ideas so much, they banned imported cows. Now, one of my personal favorites, the gossip tax. In some 14th century towns, there was an official fine for gossiping. If you were caught spreading rumors, you had to pay a small fee. Or, if you couldn't afford it, wear a wooden shame mask called a scold's bridle. It looked like an iron muzzle, and it had a tiny plate that pressed against your tongue to keep you from talking. Medieval problem-solving at its finest. "Oh, you talk too much. We'll fix that with mild torture." But here's the best part. Some women started decorating their scold's bridles with flowers and ribbons, turning them into fashion statements. The broom law. Next up, housekeeping. The broom law. In a few villages in France and Germany, you weren't allowed to sweep your floor after sunset. Why? Because they believed dust was full of wandering souls at night. If you swept them out, you were chasing away your luck. So imagine you spill flour after dinner, and your grandma's like, "Don't you dare. That's Gerald. He died last winter." The result? Most medieval homes had a lot of dirt. But hey, apparently it was lucky dirt. Candle laws and fire fear. Then there were candle laws. Fire was a huge deal. Houses were mostly wood and thatch, so towns passed weirdly specific rules. You couldn't light more than 2 candles during supper. You couldn't leave a candle alone, even for a moment. And my favorite, you couldn't pray near a candle after midnight, because people believed the devil could appear in the flame's reflection if you looked too long. Basically, don't light candles, don't bathe, don't breathe wrong. And congratulations, you're surviving the Middle Ages. The cheese trial. This next one sounds fake, but it's real. In 14th century France, a town held a trial for a piece of cheese. Apparently, a nobleman fell sick after eating it, so they accused the cheese of being possessed. It was brought to court, questioned by a priest, and then burned at the stake. Why? Because people truly believed objects could be guilty. If bread could be holy, then cheese could be evil. And somewhere a monk probably stood there, staring into the fire, whispering, "May the Lord forgive this dairy." Silence days. Finally, there were silence days. Monasteries had them all the time, but so did some towns. On certain holy days, you literally weren't allowed to speak for 24 hours. No greetings, no songs, no small talk, just quiet. But since humans are humans, people cheated by inventing hand gestures. A monk named Bernard compiled an entire dictionary of 200 silent signals. One for bread, one for beer, even one for broccoli. So yes, they basically invented emoji in the 1100s. If you're thinking, wow, they had rules for everything, you're right. But here's the thing. In a world without police, social media, or science, rules were how people felt safe. They believed that order kept the chaos. The plague, the fire, the devil at bay. So, even if it meant sleeping perfectly still, talking with your hands, and avoiding cheese that looks suspiciously confident, people obeyed, because fear makes anything sound reasonable. If you've ever complained about your boss giving you too many rules, congratulations, you would have never survived in a medieval castle. Because back then, if you were a servant, noble, or even a knight, there were so many royal rules you'd need a personal assistant just to remember which spoon you were allowed to touch. Sounds dramatic, right? But in many medieval courts, especially in France and England, eye contact with royalty was strictly controlled. If you stared too long, you might be accused of insolence. If you didn't look at all, you might be accused of disrespect. So basically, you had to master the art of royal glancing, which is like pretending to make eye contact without actually doing it. Imagine being at a dinner table, trying to talk to someone while only looking at their crown. Yeah, that was life. The rule actually made sense in a twisted way. Kings were considered divinely chosen, so direct eye contact was seen as staring into holiness. It was like gazing into the sun, spiritually dangerous, apparently, but also it was a great way for kings to make everyone feel small and awkward, which, let's be honest, was half the point. Now, let's move on to food, because of course, there were royal eating rules, and they were so absurd that even Gordon Ramsay would have cried. For example, no one could start eating before the king took the first bite. That seems reasonable, until you realize that if the king was busy chatting, or just didn't feel like eating yet, everyone else had to just sit there, staring at a roasted swan that was slowly getting cold. Also, no one could finish before the king did. So if His Majesty wanted to savor his soup for 45 minutes, you'd better be ready to sit there and pretend you weren't starving. In one English court, they even had a designated royal taster, whose only job was to test every dish before the king ate it, in case it was poisoned. If the taster survived, everyone clapped politely and dinner began. If he didn't, well, someone else got promoted. And then there were the rules about what to wear. Fashion in medieval courts wasn't just about looking rich. It was a full-blown legal system called sumptuary laws. These laws dictated who could wear what color, what fabric, and even what type of fur. Purple, for instance, was reserved for the highest nobles and the royal family. If a merchant tried to sneak in a purple scarf, he could be fined, and the scarf would literally be burned as evidence of arrogance. Gold embroidery, only for the upper nobles. Silk depends on your title. Fur, careful, ermine fur was for royals, while lower-ranked nobles had to settle for fox or rabbit. Yes, your social class could be measured by the dead animal on your cloak. Charming. The reason behind it, though, was control. In a time when wealth could be faked, but titles couldn't. Sumptuary laws made sure everyone looked like they belonged where they were. You couldn't pretend to be rich. The law literally stopped you from dressing like it. Basically, medieval fashion was the original version of verified checkmarks. Let's talk hygiene, or rather the royal version of it, because if you think kings and queens smelled like roses, you might want to lower your expectations. Royal bath rules were oddly strict. Some kings were obsessed with cleanliness, Others thought bathing was dangerous. Take King Louis XIV of France. The man reportedly hated water so much he only bathed a few times in his life. Instead, he'd wipe himself with scented cloths and drown in perfume. Apparently, if you smell like lavender, you don't need soap. But there were also rules about who could touch the king during bathing. Usually, it was only certain noble servants, and even they had to go through rituals before being allowed to enter the royal bath chamber. Sometimes a priest even blessed the water, because, holy dirt, holy soap. And speaking of weird privacy rules, in some courts, kings didn't even go to the toilet alone. There was an actual title called the Groom of the Stool. This person's job was to assist the king during his private moments. Yes, assist in the way you think. It was considered one of the most trusted royal positions. Why? Because if you're helping the king wipe, he is probably not going to keep secrets from you. Weirdly, it was a mark of high honor. Medieval logic. The closer you are to the royal butt, the closer you are to power. Now, royal relationships. Oh boy, there were a labyrinth of rules that make modern dating look peaceful. For example, many royal families had strict rules about who they could marry. Basically, no commoners allowed. But when every noble was related to each other, this rule led to a lot of interesting family trees. Let's just say medieval genetics was playing a risky game of connect the dash dots dot comma. Sometimes even kings needed permission to marry. If the Pope didn't approve the match, it could literally start a war, which, in fact, happened multiple times. Henry VIII famously changed the entire religion of England just because he wanted a divorce. That's one way to rage quit a marriage. But here's a weird one you probably didn't know. Royal sleeping rules. In many palaces, the king and queen didn't actually sleep in the same bed. They had separate chambers, not because of marital issues, but because sleeping was considered a ritual act. Every night, the king had a formal going-to-bed ceremony. Servants would help him undress, say prayers, and watch him get into bed like he was performing a sacred play. Then they'd bow, wish him good night, and leave. The same happened in the morning. The royal waking ceremony. It was like the king was rebooted every day with a Windows XP chime. And yes, people were literally paid to tuck him in. There were also banquet behavior rules that bordered on insane. For example, if the king dropped food, no one was allowed to pick it up, not even him, because touching fallen royal food was beneath the throne. So if a chicken leg fell off the table, it just stayed there, forever. In some courts, knights had to stand through the entire feast, just in case the king needed something. Meanwhile, the king sat on a massive throne, and sometimes had musicians play just for his digestion, because apparently nothing says royalty like eating to the sound of medieval flutes. And perhaps the strangest rule of all, no one could turn their back on the king. If you were walking away, you had to back out of the room slowly, like a crab doing ballet. This was a real thing. People trained for it. And if you tripped while backing away, well, that was your last royal audience. But again, weirdly, it made sense. It was all about respect, control, and image. Every rule reminded people that the king wasn't just another human. He was the human chosen by God, untouchable. unstar, and apparently unbathed. By now, you might be thinking, why would anyone want to live like this? Why would people follow such ridiculous rules? Because that was how medieval society worked, through symbols, rituals, and a whole lot of anxiety. Every tiny act was meant to reinforce a giant idea that the king was sacred, the nobles were important, and everyone else was lucky just to exist near them. So next time your boss asks you to follow office rules, just remember, at least you don't have to bow before you send an email. At least you don't have to back out of a Zoom meeting. And thank God no one's checking the color of your shirt. To decide if you're allowed to eat lunch, let's start with something mild. Imagine being fined for gossip. Yes, gossip. In some medieval towns, especially in England and Germany, there was a punishment called the scold's bridle. It looked like a metal cage that fit over your head, with an iron bit that went into your mouth. If you talked too much, the bridle made sure you physically couldn't. It was used mostly for women accused of nagging or speaking out of turn. So basically, the medieval solution to Twitter. The logic behind it was simple in that terrible medieval way. Silence equals peace. Of course, it was humiliating and cruel, but in a society obsessed with order, public shaming was considered a community service. You'd be paraded through town, everyone would laugh, and the message was clear: don't gossip or you'll get a free metal face mask. Then there was the ducking stool. If someone was accused of witchcraft, adultery, or being generally annoying, they'd be tied to a wooden chair attached to a long beam and repeatedly dunked into a river. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, congratulations, you were innocent. You just drowned. It's one of those rules that makes you wonder if medieval people were just collectively tired of logic. But here's the darkly funny part. This trial by water wasn't random. It came from a belief that pure water rejected impurity. So, if the accused floated, the water was literally rejecting them, which, I guess, made sense if you were half asleep and living in the 1200s. Now, let's talk about the pillory. The medieval version of the comments section. It was that wooden board with holes for your head and hands. They'd put you in the town square, and everyone passing by could throw rotten food, yell insults, or sometimes small rocks. You'd stand there for hours, maybe days. No phone, no bathroom, no hope. But again, there was logic. Public humiliation was supposed to teach you a lesson and entertain the crowd. A sort of medieval Netflix. The town square was the original social media feed, and the pillory was what happened when you got ratioed in real life. But sometimes punishments weren't about humiliation. They were about creativity. Medieval people turned cruelty into an art form. Take the chair of torture. It was a spiked iron seat, hundreds of sharp points on the surface, and when the victim sat down, their weight did the rest. Sometimes they'd even heat the chair from below, because apparently pain wasn't enough unless it was toasty, or the rat torture, where a metal bucket with a live rat was tied to your stomach, and the other end was heated with fire. The rat, trying to escape, would dig its way out. Congratulations, you've just invented nightmare fuel. Yet again, these weren't random acts of cruelty. They were meant to make others behave. Fear was cheaper than law enforcement. Then there was trial by ordeal, a system that was so insane it almost worked. If you were accused of a crime, you could prove your innocence through a divine test. For example, holding a red-hot iron bar for several seconds. If your hand didn't blister too badly after 3 days, God had clearly protected you. If it did, well, you clearly needed to pray harder. There was also ordeal by fire, ordeal by water, and even ordeal by combat, where 2 people literally fought to the death, and whoever survived was considered blessed by God. The logic was flawless, because apparently God moonlighted as a referee. One recorded case from the 12th century involved a woman accused of adultery, who had to walk 9 paces over red-hot plowshare. She survived with minor burns, so, naturally, the court declared her innocent. Faith, 1. Physics, 0. Not all punishments were deadly, though. Some were just bizarrely specific. In France, bakers who cheated customers by selling underweight bread were forced to be tied to a post, with the fake loaf round their neck. In Germany, musicians who played badly could have their instruments destroyed publicly, and sometimes their hands. Imagine a world where playing a bad lute solo could literally end your career. And in one town in Italy, men who refused to marry by a certain age had to parade through the streets wearing women's clothing, because nothing says social pressure like forced cross-dressing in public. Even animals could be punished. Yes, actual animals. Medieval courts sometimes held full trials for pigs, goats, or even insects. A pig that killed a child might be dressed in human clothes, tried in court, found guilty, and executed. Publicly, there are real records of these events, complete with judges, lawyers, and witnesses. One 14th century case involved a rooster, accused of laying an egg, a sign of witchcraft. The rooster was found guilty and burned alive, because obviously science wasn't invited to that trial. But again, there was reasoning behind it. Punishing animals symbolically restored the moral order. If something bad happened, someone or something had to pay for it. It wasn't justice. It was theater, bloody, absurd, and somehow satisfying. And then there were the weirdly symbolic punishments. Like in England, where thieves might be branded on the hand, a permanent reminder to everyone they met. In some cases, judges ordered people to wear shame masks, metal faces shaped like donkeys or pigs. You'd walk around town, jingling like a Christmas ornament of failure, or the drunkard's cloak, a barrel with holes cut out for your head and arms. If you got too drunk, you'd have to wear it and parade through town. It was like being forced to cosplay as your own bad decisions. These punishments worked not because they were fair, but because they were visible. In a world without newspapers or TikTok, public pain was the news. Now, the church had its own system to. Religious punishment was all about guilt, spiritual torture instead of physical. Pilgrimages were a common sentence. If you sinned, you might be ordered to walk hundreds of miles to a holy site as penance. Some people never came back. Others cheated. They just circled their own village and claimed divine exhaustion. There were also confession punishments, where priests made sinners announce their sins in public. Imagine telling your worst secret to a room full of people who already suspected it. That was medieval therapy. But perhaps the strangest thing about all of this is how normal it seemed to them. People believed justice came directly from God. So pain wasn't cruelty, it was purification. Every scar was proof that the universe still cared. It's weirdly poetic in a horrifying way. And honestly, it kind of worked, because fear kept people in line. Most didn't steal, not because they were good, but because they didn't want to end up in a metal donkey mask, while their neighbors threw cabbage at them. By the late Middle Ages, though, things started to change. Punishments became less theatrical and more practical. Jails became more common, and people started thinking maybe burning each other wasn't the best system. Shocking progress, I know, but those early centuries left a mark. A fascination with justice that entertains as much as it punishes. You can still see it today. We binged true crime documentaries, gossip about celebrity scandals, and love watching instant karma clips. It's the same instinct, just with fewer torches. Let's start with one of the worst, the gong farmer. A gong wasn't a musical instrument. It was a polite medieval word for human waste. So yes, the gong farmer was the person responsible for cleaning the big underground holes where castles and towns dumped all their biological poetry. They worked only at night, because the smell was so horrific that cities banned them from working in daylight. They climbed into pits with buckets, scraped out the contents, and hauled it away to dump in fields as fertilizer. Pay was surprisingly good, sometimes up to 6pence a night, which was solid money for the time, but the life expectancy. Let's just say no one retired from gong farming. You either quit early or drowned in your own job description. And yet, medieval sanitation literally depended on them. Without gong farmers, the city would drown in filth, and plague would spread faster than gossip in a monastery. So yes, the gong farmer was gross, but also a hero. A very, very smelly hero. Next up, the leech collector. Because what's better than crawling through mud? Crawling through mud full of blood-sucking parasites. Leeches were used for medicine. Bloodletting was the go-to cure for almost everything. Fever, headaches, heartbreak, probably bad vibes too. Doctors loved leeches so much that people had to go out and catch them by hand. And how did they do that? Simple. They waded into swamps and let the leeches attach to their legs. When enough were stuck, they peeled them off and store them in jars. Imagine that as your daily routine. Morning, dear. I'm off to stand in a swamp until I faint. If you're lucky, you only lose a pint of blood before lunch. It was dangerous, miserable, and yet respected, because medicine needed them. In some towns, leech collectors were licensed professionals. You could say they were the first healthcare workers, just with way more mud and trauma. Now let's talk about the sin. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. In some parts of England and Wales, when someone died, a senator was hired to spiritually consume the sins of the deceased. They'd place bread and ale on the corpse, say a few prayers, then eat and drink it, symbolically taking on the person's sins. Afterward, they were paid a few coins and sent away quickly, because people believed they were now full of evil energy. Basically, a human trash can for guilt. Senators were social outcasts. but also necessary. No priest wanted to touch unconfessed souls, so these poor souls did the dirty spiritual work. It's poetic, tragic, and honestly kind of metal. Imagine explaining that at a medieval dinner party. Oh me, I freelance in soul digestion. Then there was the knocker-up. Before alarm clocks existed, this was the person whose job was to wake others up. They'd walk through the streets at dawn, carrying a long stick, and tap on people's windows until they woke. Sometimes they used pea shooters to hit higher windows. Imagine getting paid to annoy people before sunrise. Basically, a professional sibling. It sounds silly, but it was a serious profession even into the early modern era. Factories relied on to make sure workers arrived on time, and the best ones had regular clients. They were basically human alarm apps, with better customer service. Now, for something truly absurd. The royal food taster. If you remember from Chapter 3, poison was a common assassination method. So kings and queens hired official tasters to test every meal before they did. Job description: 1. Eat suspicious food. 2. Don't die. 3. If you die, thanks for your service. It sounds terrifying, but royal tasters were actually honored positions. They often got high pay and fancy titles. Though, of course, there's the daily chance that your breakfast kills you. Still, imagine the trust involved. If the king liked you, you might live a long, well-fed life. If he didn't, you might get dessert first, permanently. Moving on, the plague barrier. During outbreaks like the Black Death, entire cities were overwhelmed with corpses. Plague barriers were hired to collect the dead and hold them to mass graves. They worked non-stop, day and night, for almost no pay. Most died quickly from the same disease, but some became eerily desensitized, singing while they worked, making jokes about death just to cope. They wore long coats soaked in vinegar and masks stuffed with herbs. Early prototypes of the plague doctor look. If history had a worst job award, this one would win by unanimous diseased vote. Another terrifying profession, the executioner. Contrary to popular belief, executioners weren't always villains. In fact, they were respected and hated at the same time. They had to be precise. Too many swings of the axe, and you'd anger the crowd. To clean a cut, and you were accused of enjoying it. They lived outside city walls, ate alone, and couldn't attend church like normal citizens. But everyone needed them. The irony: executioners were also sometimes doctors, since they had detailed knowledge of anatomy. So yes, the man who might chop your head off could also cure your toothache. Talk about career versatility. Then there's the fuller, the person who cleaned newly woven cloth. How did they do it? By stomping on it in tubs of urine. Yep. Urine contains ammonia, which helped whiten and clean wool. So fullers spent hours barefoot in tubs, stomping, squishing, and breathing in fumes that could melt a modern-day influencer's will to live. Cities smelled terrible because of them. But everyone needed clean clothes. They were like medieval laundry workers, underpaid, overworked, and constantly dizzy. You might think the weirdness ends there, but no welcome to the royal groom of the stool. We met him briefly before, But let's give this man the recognition he deserves. His job? Assist the king in his most private moments, prepare the toilet, hand over linen cloth, and occasionally, yes, wipe. Sounds degrading, but it was one of the most trusted positions in the royal court. He knew all the king's secrets, literally and politically. Some even became powerful advisors. So, in short, medieval career advice: it's not what you do, it's whose but you serve. Now, a slightly less gross one: the herb woman. Before pharmacies existed, these were local healers who gathered plants, mixed potions, and sold them as medicine. They knew which herbs could heal wounds, which could calm pain, and which could send your neighbor on a spiritual journey. Some were revered as wise women, others got accused of witchcraft and burned. Occupational hazard, apparently, but they kept medieval villages alive, especially when doctors were just priests with bandages. In a world full of superstition, herb women were the closest thing to science. And then, one of the weirdest of all, the dog whipper. Churches hired men whose sole job was to remove dogs that wandered inside during services. They carried long sticks or whips, and gently or not so gently chased them out, because apparently medieval dogs loved interrupting sermons. Some churches even had official dog benches, so people could tie their pets before Mass. The dog whipper was a real paid profession, a holy bouncer for dogs, and honestly, that sounds kind of fun. Another strange but noble job: the alchemist's apprentice. Imagine spending your whole life trying to turn metal into gold, and never succeeding. Alchemists promised miracles, eternal life, perfect health, infinite wealth. Their apprentices did all the actual work, grinding, mixing, inhaling toxic fumes. Some lost their minds from mercury poisoning, others just lost patience. Still, alchemy paved the way for modern chemistry. So, while they didn't make gold, they did make science, and also a lot of smoke. One final honorable mention: the corpse watcher. Before burial, medieval people feared that the dead might rise again, not metaphorically, but literally. So families hired watchers to sit beside corpses overnight, to ensure they stayed, well, dead. They'd sit in silence, light candles, and sometimes read psalms. Other times they just drank ale to stay awake. It was creepy, lonely, and occasionally terrifying, especially when a dead person suddenly twitched. But it was necessary, because in a world where medicine was bad, and people sometimes got buried alive, you wanted someone double-checking your status. And that's medieval employment for you, a mix of filth, faith, and fear. Every job existed for a reason, even the disgusting ones. Someone had to do it. Someone had to clean, collect, bury, wake, or eat sins, so the rest of society could keep pretending it was civilized. It's kind of poetic, really. Medieval life was a machine built on suffering, and the people who oiled it were invisible. The gong farmers, the plague barriers, the leech collectors. They kept the world turning while holding their breath. So, as you drift off tonight, be thankful for modern jobs. No one's asking you to wade through a swamp, taste poison soup, or chase dogs out of church. And if your boss ever complains about your performance, just whisper softly, "At least I'm not a gong farmer," because in the Middle Ages, that would have been your promotion. Let's begin with what everyone in medieval Europe wanted most. Pale skin. To them, pale skin meant wealth, purity, and indoor living. If you were tanned, it meant you worked in the sun. A peasant, a laborer, or someone who knew what manual labor felt like. So women, and sometimes men, went to extreme lengths to whiten their faces. Their secret weapon, lead. Yes, they literally rubbed lead on their faces, usually in the form of ceruse, a cosmetic paste made from vinegar and white lead powder. It looked flawless, smooth, and pale. Also, it slowly poisoned you. After months of use, lead makeup would eat into the skin, cause headaches, tooth loss, tremors, and eventually death. But hey, they looked great doing it. In fact, Queen Elizabeth I of England famously used it so much that her skin began to rot underneath. She covered it with thicker and thicker layers of lead paint, until her face was practically a toxic mask. So yes, glow from within had a very different meaning back then. Of course, not everyone could afford poison-level makeup. Peasants had their own tricks. They used flour, ground chalk, or even crushed eggshells to lighten their faces. Some rubbed vinegar or sour milk to peel off tanned skin. Homemade chemical peels, 14th century edition. If that sounds painful, it's because it was. But again, appearance mattered. People believed outward beauty reflected the soul. So if your skin looked rough, it wasn't just unattractive, it was morally suspicious. Now let's talk hair. In medieval art, women were often shown with long, golden hair. Blonde was the ideal, the angelic color. The problem? Almost no one was naturally blonde in Northern Europe, so they faked it. Their method: mixing saffron, ashes, and urine into a paste, spreading it on their hair, and sitting for hours under the sun. The ammonia from the urine bleached the hair, and the saffron added a yellow tint. Congratulations, you're now halfway between divine and disgusting. Monks recorded these recipes proudly, as if God himself approved of the pea hair process. And men, by the way, also joined in, because nothing says courtly elegance like smelling faintly of a medieval latrine. Speaking of smells, let's address the obvious: hygiene. Bathing was rare, uncontroversial. In some parts of Europe, public bathhouses existed, and people actually enjoyed soaking with herbs and oils. But after the plague, many believed that hot water opened the pores, allowing disease to enter the body, so they stopped bathing. Instead, they dry cleaned themselves with cloths soaked in vinegar or rose water, or they simply changed their undergarments and called it a day. Because in medieval logic, clean linen equals clean body. Some nobles even bragged about how little they bathed. King Louis XIV of France reportedly bathed only a handful of times in his life. He preferred perfume, lots and lots of perfume. So did everyone else. The rich wore scented gloves, perfumed wigs, and even dabbed flowers in their armpits. Because when you smell like roses, no one can prove you haven't touched soap since Easter. Now, teeth. The medieval smile was complicated. Toothbrushes didn't really exist. So people used rough cloth twigs or crushed herbs to clean their teeth. And toothpaste? Try this recipe from a 14th century manuscript. Burnt rosemary, powdered salt, crushed bone, and honey. A sweet and salty disaster. But here's the weird part. In some cultures, black teeth were considered beautiful. In Japan, women of high rank painted their teeth black using a dye called oa. It was seen as elegant and mature, a mark of loyalty and refinement. So while Europeans were scrubbing with ashes, some Asians were smiling proudly with inky black teeth. Different continents, same level of confusion. Now, about eyebrows. In medieval England, fashion said the ideal forehead should be long, high, and smooth. So women plucked their eyebrows completely off, and even shaved part of their hairline to make their foreheads look taller. The look was pure and intelligent. To us, it looks like someone lost a fight with a candle flame. But trends are trends, and back then, people followed them religiously. Some women even drew faint golden lines where their eyebrows used to be. Others just powdered the area white and hoped no one noticed. Spoiler, everyone noticed. And then there were beauty marks. Tiny black dots painted on the face, but not randomly. Their placement had meaning. A mark near the lip meant flirtatious. Near the eye meant mysterious. On the cheek meant bold. Basically, the medieval version of emoji flirting. They were made using soot, berries, or even burnt cork, which, compared to lead paint, was practically skincare. For men, beauty had its own rules. A strong beard symbolized power, unless you were a monk, in which case facial hair was considered vanity. Knights often oiled their hair and perfumed their armor, because smelling good was part of courtly love. And manly scent meant something different then. They didn't have deodorant. So many used spices, rubbing themselves with cinnamon, clove, or nutmeg oil, a literal walking gingerbread man of war. Let's talk about makeup on men, surprisingly common in noble circles. Men at court used powder to pale their faces, rouge to add color, and perfume on every visible surface. This wasn't seen as effeminate. It showed wealth and refinement. The natural look was for peasants. It's funny to think, if a medieval noble time-traveled to today, they'd probably call influencers underdressed. Now for one of the most cursed trends. Belladonna. The name means beautiful woman, but it's also a deadly plant. Women used drops of belladonna juice in their eyes to make their pupils dilate, giving them a soft, dreamy look. It also caused blindness, hallucinations, and heart failure. But that didn't stop anyone. Fashion hurts, and in the Middle Ages, it could literally kill you. Let's not forget corsetry, or rather, its early form. Before modern corsets, medieval women used stiffened bodices, made of whalebone, wood, or even metal plates, to shape their figures. Tight waists were fashionable, but practicality wasn't. Some fainted during banquets. Others simply couldn't breathe properly. Doctors warned against it. But since most doctors thought bleeding cured everything, no one listened. And yes, men sometimes wore padded chests and codpieces to appear more heroic. We'll leave that mystery unexamined. Then came wigs. Lice was a constant problem, so shaving your head and wearing a wig was actually a hygiene solution, but those wigs weren't made of synthetic fibers. They were human or horse hair, often crawling with the very problem they were meant to avoid. Still, nobles decorated them with ribbons, feathers, even jewels. And if you were rich enough, you had a wig servant whose entire job was to comb and perfume it. Imagine being poor and hearing that someone gets paid to style another. Man's fake hair. The class divide was fragrant. By now, you might be wondering, was there anyone in the Middle Ages who looked good naturally? Probably yes, but they didn't write history books. Most beauty standards came from paintings of nobles, which were idealized. Artists were told, make her skin paler, make his hair brighter, and erase that wart, please. So medieval beauty was more myth than reality. Just like today, only with more disease. But here's the twist. For all their strange and deadly methods, medieval beauty wasn't just vanity. It was identity. Pale skin showed purity. Golden hair meant grace. Clean linen meant moral. Every detail was symbolic, a language of virtue written on the body. So even when they were poisoning themselves, they believed they were expressing something higher. Their soul, their faith, their worth, and that's oddly human. We still do it, different tools, same psychology. We just swapped lead paint for foundation and belladonna for contact lenses, but the message is the same. I belong, I matter, I'm beautiful. Please don't die from this serum. Let's begin with the nightmare of bread. In the Middle Ages, bread wasn't just food. It was holy. Every loaf carried the symbol of the cross before baking, to keep out demons. If a loaf cracked wearily in the oven, it meant someone in the village would die soon. If you cut bread at night, the devil would sit beside you, and if you dropped a slice face down, you'd invited misfortune into your house. So yes, medieval people basically invented the 5-second rule, but with eternal damnation as the consequence. Now, cats. Poor cats, especially black ones. Before they were internet icons, they were considered miniature demons. Priests claimed they helped witches fly to Sabbaths. Villagers believed their eyes glowed with stolen souls. So every Friday the 13th, before Easter, people threw cats from towers to purify the town. Ironically, when the plague arrived, spread by rats, everyone suddenly wondered where all the cats had gone. Lesson learned. Don't persecute your best pest control. Speaking of witches, no superstition list is complete without them. To spot a witch, medieval people carried witch bottles, glass jars filled with nails, hair, and urine. If buried under your doorstep, it supposedly trapped curses. If the bottle cracked, it meant a witch nearby was really mad. There were also witch cakes, made from rye flour and the victim's own urine, baked, then fed to a dog. If the dog barked strangely, you'd found your witch. Science, obviously. Then there were the bells. People rang church bells during storms, to chase away demons riding thunder. Problem: bells are made of metal. Lightning meets superstition. Records show dozens of bell ringers struck dead but since the survivors thought it worked, they kept doing it. Faith can be electrifying. Let's visit the bedroom next. Sleep wasn't peaceful. It was spiritual warfare. Nightmares were believed to be demons called Mara, or incubi sitting on your chest while you slept. To protect yourself, you could place iron scissors under the pillow, a Bible at your feet, or sprinkle holy water on your sheets. If you woke up breathless, they said the demon had ridden you. We call it sleep paralysis now, but they called it Tuesday night. In some villages, mirrors were covered at night. Why? Because your reflection could leave your body while sleeping. If someone moved the mirror, your soul might not find its way back. Imagine waking up groggy and realizing you forgot where your reflection parked itself. Left-handed people, beware. The word sinister literally comes from the Latin for left. If you wrote or ate with your left hand, people assumed you had a pact with evil. Many kids were punished until they switched hands. So next time you meet a lefty, congratulate them on surviving medieval PR. Now, superstitions about water. Wells were sacred gateways to other worlds. Before drawing water, women whispered a small prayer to the well spirit. Dropping anything inside was a disaster, especially iron, because spirits hated it. To calm them, people tossed bread or coins into the water. The origin of wishing wells, exactly that, a bribe wrapped in hope. Meanwhile, shoes carried magic. Old boots were stuffed into walls during construction to ward off bad luck. Archaeologists still find them hidden in castles, sometimes along with chicken bones and hair bundles. A medieval firewall, basically, but made of superstition and questionable hygiene. One of the strangest fears was the wind. Strong gusts weren't weather, they were curses. If your candle blew out suddenly, it meant an invisible spirit had entered the room. People spat 3 times toward the east. To keep away wind demons, sailors refused to whistle on ships. They believed it summoned storms. So medieval voyages were silent, smelly, and super tense. Now, animals in general were walking omens. Owls symbolized death. Ravens were messengers from hell. Toads carried curses. And if one croaked near your house, you needed holy water immediately. Meanwhile, dogs howling at night were thought to see wandering souls. If the howl continued after midnight, someone nearby would die soon. Every sound had meaning. Every shadow a threat. The medieval world was basically one giant haunted house, with better hats. Let's talk about numbers. The number 3 was holy. The number 7 was divine. The number 13 pure chaos. So much so that medieval scribes sometimes skipped it entirely in page numbering. You'd go from page 12 straight to 14, because superstition was stronger than arithmetic. Even more cursed, sneezing 3 times in a row. The first was a blessing, the second fine, but the third meant a demon had tried to exit your body and failed, hence the custom. God bless you. An exorcism in polite disguise. Curses, of course, were the medieval internet. You could curse anyone, neighbors, cows, even bread. Monks wrote entire manuals on counterspell. A famous one advised you to write the offender's name on parchment, boil it in vinegar, then bury it under a crossroads at midnight, because everyone knows demons respect municipal road layouts. There were also love curses. If your crush ignored you, you could pierce a wax figure with pins and whisper a Latin charm. If they felt sudden chest pain, congratulations, you'd just invented voodoo fanfiction. But beware, love magic often backfired. One man reportedly tried a spell to attract a woman, only to fall madly in love with a goat. The local priest simply wrote, "Divine justice was served." Then there were corpse superstitions. If a dead body bled when touched, it meant the murderer was near. If a cat jumped over the coffin, the deceased might rise again. To prevent this, some families watched the corpse all night. The original graveyard shift. Graveyards also had rules. Never step on a grave, never whistle there, and never bring flowers that weren't blessed, because apparently unholy daisies offended ghosts. Let's not forget church superstitions. People collected holy water like lucky charms. They drank it, washed wounds with it, and sprinkled it on cows for better milk. During plague years, some even boiled bread in it. Because when panic meets religion, you get a very soggy breakfast. In homes, protection charms were everywhere. Iron horseshoes above doors, crosses made of straw, and dried herbs hanging from beams. Garlic wasn't just for vampires. It was believed to repel envy. Some mothers sewed wolf teeth into children's clothes to protect them from the evil eye. Honestly, medieval moms were hardcore. One of the creepiest fears. The changelings. People believed fairies stole healthy babies and replaced them with sickly, silent ones. If a child cried too much, some thought it wasn't human. To prove it, they'd heat a poker in the fire, and if the baby laughed, it was a fairy. If it didn't, well, you don't want to know. It's one of the darkest chapters of medieval folklore, proof that fear can be crueler than monsters. And then the moon. The moon was powerful, too powerful. Full moons drove people mad, caused floods, even made cheese spoil faster. If a cow stared at the moon too long, its milk would turn bloody. So farmers covered pails and muttered prayers at night. "Luna," they whispered, "leave my dairy alone." Some monks refused to write under moonlight, believing the glow carried temptation. Imagine trying to finish a manuscript while avoiding a seductive moonbeam. As absurd as all this sounds, it wasn't just ignorance. Superstition gave comfort. In a world without science, where storms, sickness, and death came without warning, believing you could do something, even if it meant spitting eastward 3 times, made life feel less random. Superstition was medieval therapy, a ritual against chaos, and in a strange way, we still have them. Knock on wood. Avoid black cats. Don't open umbrellas indoors. They're eco-soft, surviving whispers of medieval fear. So as you drift towards sleep, think of those villagers lighting candles, muttering charms, hiding shoes in their walls, and ringing bells at thunder. They weren't stupid. They were human, trying to feel safe in a world that never stopped scaring them, just like us. So, if something creaks tonight, don't worry. It's probably just history saying hello. The first comfort, silence. Imagine this: no cars, no airplanes, no TikTok notifications, no neighbors doing karaoke at midnight. The loudest thing you might hear in a medieval village was a cow, maybe a rooster, maybe your own thoughts, which were probably about bread. At night, the only light came from the moon or a flickering candle. People went to bed when it got dark. They woke up when the sun came up. Their bodies followed nature's rhythm, something we now pay wellness influencers to teach us again. They didn't call it a sleep schedule. It was just life. Then there was bread. Simple, warm, honest bread. Not gluten-free, ancient-grained sourdough activated by moonlight, just bread. Every household had a version of it. It was their comfort food, their daily routine, their literal survival. You'd wake up to the smell of baking dough, crackling wood, and the comforting sound of something normal in a world that wasn't. And if you were lucky enough, someone in the village was the bread gossip. You know, that one person who knew exactly whose dough didn't rise, who added too much water, and who probably cried while kneading. Bread wasn't just food. It was warmth, rhythm, and the taste of safety. Now, let's talk about community. Medieval people didn't have group chats, but they did have something arguably better: each other. When you lived in a village of 200 people, you couldn't just ignore your neighbors. You needed them for harvest, for protection, for gossip. Every event, from weddings to funerals, was shared. Sure, sometimes it came with a side of which accusations or tax collection, but most of the time it meant laughter, singing, and people sitting around fires telling stories. So old no one remembered who started them. It was messy, but it was connection, and in the quiet of those evenings, no screens. No scrolling, you could actually hear the sound of people being human. Gardens were another comfort. Every home had one. They weren't aesthetic Instagram gardens with fairy lights and raised beds. They were patchy, muddy, imperfect little miracles of green. They grew herbs for cooking, medicine, and sometimes even magic. A bit of mint for the stew, sage for the soul, and maybe, if your neighbor wasn't looking, a little mandrake root to keep spirits away. For many, the garden was therapy before therapy existed. You'd step outside, touch the soil, breathe the air, and remember that not everything in life had to be grand. Some things could just grow quietly. There was also something strangely soothing about rituals. Every day had structure. Bells marked the hours. Farmers worked. Monks prayed. Bakers baked. It wasn't freedom in the modern sense, but it gave life a rhythm, a meaning, a flow. Even grief had a process, a place, a prayer. There was comfort in knowing that every sunrise meant work, and every sunset meant rest. Modern life often feels like a blur, but back then time moved in circles, not lines. You could feel it in the way the seasons changed. The crops grew, and the candles slowly melted, and finally there was faith. Not just in a religious sense, but faith in something. That life had order, that even suffering had purpose, whether through church bells, pagan festivals, or whispered bedtime prayers. People believed the world was bigger than them. That belief, no matter how strange or wrong or naive it seems now, gave them peace. And peace in the medieval world was rare. It's funny, isn't it? We look back and laugh at them, at their weird medicine. their fear of comets, their obsession with saints' bones. But maybe, in their quiet simplicity, they had something we've lost. They didn't need digital detox weekends. They didn't meditate to ambient forest sounds, they lived in one. They didn't chase meaningful lives. They already had them because survival was meaning. So tonight, as you lie there, maybe think of them, the nameless, sleepy people of the medieval world, bakers and monks, farmers and dreamers, people who found peace in the soft glow of candlelight, in the warmth of bread, in the hum of life as it simply existed. So, that's it. 8 sleepy chapters, thousands of years of history, and not a single dragon-slaying hero in sight. Just people, ordinary, weird, stubbornly human people doing their best in a world that never really made sense. They prayed, they fought, they farmed. They invented strange rules about bread and taxes. And somehow they survived. And maybe that's all history really is, the story of people trying to live. Even when life was kind of ridiculous. If you've made it this far, maybe you've started to notice something. That the world back then wasn't so different from ours. We still search for comfort, for meaning, for someone to talk to when the night feels too long. We just do it with Wi-Fi and worse posture. So, wherever you are right now, lying in bed, half asleep, eyes heavy, take a slow breath. You've traveled through centuries tonight. You've listened to the whispers of forgotten kings, the chatter of medieval villages, the quiet rhythm of a world long gone. And now it's time to rest. Let the past fade. Let the noise fade. And let yourself drift slowly, softly, like candle smoke in a cold stone chapel. Because history will still be here tomorrow. Boring, strange, beautiful as ever. And you've earned some peace. Good night, traveler. Sleep well. We'll meet again, somewhere in time,